So I want to say good evening to everybody. My name is Mary Newton. I'm the Vice President of the Reading League Wisconsin. And I want to welcome all of you to this presentation on navigating the world of research. I have a few announcements before we start. If you could please keep your mics muted, that I think will help the meeting go as smoothly as possible. If you have questions, you can pop them in the chat and we will get to as many as we can. If you need a certificate of attendance for this evening, near the end of the hour, I'll post a link in the chat box and you can click on the link and all you need to do is enter your name and your email address. But please do that this evening because we're going to send out all those certificates in one batch tomorrow. Let's see what else. We have a handout of the slides and I will actually post that in the chat right now. So there's your handout of the slides. And as you probably saw, we are recording this evening and we will upload the recording to our YouTube channel. So it's going to be a public recording, so you won't need a password to access that. And I don't want to waste any more time. So it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for the evening, Reading League Wisconsin board member, Dr. Steve Dykstra. Steve, go ahead.
All right. So this is one of the topics I've talked about at a number of conferences. I think it's always popular, navigating the world of research. Research can be very intimidating to people, these tables of numbers, and there's all these Greek letters and little abbreviations. And what does all this mean? And I feel bad that sometimes that's intimidating to people. I'm going to talk a little bit about understanding some of that and talk a little bit about if somebody drops a research paper in front of me, what do I do? And I'll give you a little teaser on that. I do not start from page one and read the pages in order. I skip around. There's certain things I want to see first because they give me a better idea of what I'm looking at. If I read all the stuff in the beginning, I can grow kind of numb before I get to certain sections of the study. And so I like to start with another section, and I'll tell you about that in a little while. And quite frankly, if that section doesn't wow me, if I'm disappointed in that section, or I think it's not up to snuff, I don't bother to read the rest of it. So navigating the world of research while using as little math as possible. I can't promise you no math. You're going to have to do a little bit of math. You're going to have to know that 70 is bigger than 50. You're going to have to understand small numbers and decimal points, but I think everybody should be able to do that. Let's see. Why is my... Oh, there we go. So we have to understand that the statistics in research, the statistics we see in research papers are really telling a story. They're a tool for telling a story. And we have to understand the story that they're trying to tell us. We don't have to know how the math works behind them. You don't have to know how to calculate an effect size. You have to know how to calculate an ANOVA or how multivariate regression works. But you have to understand that they're telling you a story. And one of the things they're telling you is, are some things, 2 things, 5 things, 10 things, the number of things can vary, but are these things the same or are they different? In some research designs, finding that they're different is the really exciting thing. So I start out with 2 groups of kids that look like they're the same. And I send one over here for one kind of teaching, and I send the other group over here for a different kind of teaching. And I check back on them in 6 months. And the group that started, these 2 groups that started out the same, now they're different. And we use statistics to tell us how different they are and how likely they would have been that different just by random chance. And if it's very unlikely that this is random chance, we say that the statistics found that the difference was statistically significant. It gets more complicated than that, but that's really what they're trying to tell us. They're trying to tell us that if they're same or different. Now, correlational studies that look at simple correlations called Pearson's R, or multivariate correlations that get so complicated, they're among the statistics that can only be done by computers. When I was taking stats courses in graduate school, and I had 2 of them, all the statistics we did, we could still do by hand. There are such sophisticated statistics now that nobody can do them by hand. They're all done by computers. The most recent study that I think a lot of us were excited about that showed that in the I3 study, that the kids who got reading recovery by the time they were in 3rd or 4th grade, they were actually doing worse than they would have been if they got nothing. That's a very exciting result from our point of view. We like that study probably more than we should. But the statistics in there are incredibly complicated. You couldn't do them by hand. They're all done by computers. Those multivariate, multiple regression studies and correlational studies are trying to say if two things are really the same. So in that case, it's very exciting to find out they're the same, that they're really the same thing. That, you know, if you measured if you correlated somebody's hand size with their weight, and you found out that there was a perfect correlation, then if that was true, if you knew their hand size, you knew their weight. They're really the same measurement. That doesn't happen, but there would be some correlation. If you correlated how well kids did on a phonemic awareness measure with how well they could read for comprehension, and the correlation was very, very high. It was approaching perfect. Perfect for correlations is 1.0. If the correlation was 1.0, then that would mean that phonemic awareness was the whole thing. It was completely responsible for comprehension. Of course, that's not the case. Lots of things are responsible for comprehension, and your ability to tease out words and decode them is only one of them. When we're looking at experimental studies where we take two groups of kids that are hopefully pretty much the same, and we do something to one or we do something to the other, we want to know from our statistics if they became different. Now we know something happened. Something happened to them in our study, because these two groups used to be pretty much the same, and now they're quite different from each other. What the statistics cannot tell you by themselves, this is where it requires reasonable judgment and some knowledge of what's going on, some background knowledge about how reading works. What they can't tell you is what made that difference. We would like to believe it's the experimental, it's the treatment variable in the study. We'd like to believe it's the way we taught them, but depending on the design of the study, that may not be it. And we're going to talk about a study at the end here where the differences aren't what they seem to be. And as you look at the nature of the study, you start realizing maybe this isn't what it seems to be. Now, this last bullet point here, D versus P. In statistical language, we've all heard about effect sizes. We get very excited about effect sizes in the reading world. The report of the National Reading Panel had tables and tables of effect sizes as a very important statistic. Meta-analyses like that use lots of effect sizes. Meta-analyses are studies of studies. So you collect a bunch of studies that sort of that have something in common. You aggregate them together and you generate an effect size. And that's very important work. It's very useful to us. And effect sizes are abbreviated in the world of statistics as D. I don't know why. I would have chosen E, but you know, E might have been taken by something else. So for some reason, effect sizes are D. D has replaced P in a lot of places. And what P says, P is the representation of how likely is it that you could have created this much difference just through random chance. And the standard in social sciences, and education is a social science, the standard in social science is that we believe, we're pretty confident something happened if P is less than 5%, 0.05. There's less than a 5% chance that you would have gotten this difference just through random chance alone. That's pretty good for one study. Here's what you don't know, though. Here's what nobody knows. How many people did this study or a similar study and didn't get statistically significant results? And so they never published their paper. If there's 19 others that didn't get results and one that did, that's that 5%. That's 5% of the studies got a result, and it might be due just to random chance. What that reminds us of is we can't make too many big decisions based on one paper, based on one statistically significant finding. There could be something funny going on. There could be just random chance. That's why we need multiple studies to be sure of things. Before I go any further, one of the things I want to point out is doing studies of human beings is hard. It's really, really difficult. It's not like studying rats or mice. You know, you can do biology studies or drug studies on rats and mice, and you can have a company deliver 1,000 mice to you. They're almost genetic clones of each other. There's strains of mice that have been inbred with each other for so long that there's no genetic variability. They're all going to grow to the same size. They're all going to get sick with the same diseases. Sometimes they make strains of mice where all the hair falls off of them, and they're all running around as naked little bald mice. But those mice are genetically identical to each other. We can't do that with human beings. No matter how hard we try to make sure that this group starts out just the same as this group, they're never exactly the same. They eat different food, they live in different houses, they have different families, they've learned different things, they've gone different places. They're different from each other. And coping with those differences makes research on human beings very, very, very challenging. So statistics can tell us something that happened, but the design tells us what that something might be. So you have to pay attention to how the study is designed. And the one thing you have to know is all designs are flawed. All designs have strengths and weaknesses. They're all flawed. And again, this is the reason why we can never use just one study to make big decisions. Perfect designs are easy to imagine, but impossible to execute. When I was in graduate school, I sat around in a room with a couple of guys. We said, if we were going to become college professors, what would we want to research? And in an afternoon, we designed dozens of studies on paper that if you could do them, you could make a very successful academic career off of doing that one study and all the studies that would follow behind it. The problem is you can't do it. You can't do it. You can't do a study where you go out and you take 100 newborn babies and you tell their parents, okay, read to these babies, talk to these babies, do all these things. And then we have 100 other newborn babies over here and we order the parents, never read to your children. Never talk to them. Don't expose them to language. Let's see what happens. You know, it's a sick little study. You can't do it. You can't control people that way. You know, the perfect study for figuring out whether smoking caused cancer or not was to go get 1,000 people and tell them they all smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day, get another 1,000 people, tell them don't ever smoke cigarettes, then wait and see how each of them do for the rest of their life. You can't do that. You have to wait and see what people do for themselves and try to study it after it happens. It's very difficult to design. If people were mice, it would be very, very simple. I worked on some research when I was an undergraduate that included feeding little bits of lead to rats and then seeing how different they were from other rats that hadn't had lead. Then we did the same study on monkeys. But you can't do that to people. Thank God. You know, we can't do that to people. If we want to study lead poisoning in human beings, we have to go study people who just got lead poison in the natural course of their life. Well, they're different than the people who didn't get lead poison. They live in different parts of the city. They have different socioeconomic status. They have different access to healthcare. So they're different from each other in a lot of ways, which makes studying these things very difficult to do. And that's important that we remember because it's part of why we're always disappointed. One of the questions I get asked all the time, people write to me on the side, they approach me at conferences, they send me emails, they contact me through Facebook and they say, what's the study that proves whatever? What's the study that proves that phonemic awareness is important? What's the study that proves we should teach kids phonics? What's the study that proves whole language sucks? You know, these are questions that I get on a fairly regular basis. And I think people are often disappointed with my reply. There isn't one study. It's something that we've learned by pulling together dozens or hundreds or thousands of studies in some cases that all look very different from each other. So a group of studies that seem to point to or answer one little part of the question, and another group of studies over here that answers another part of the question, and another set of studies over there here that rules out maybe some portion of an alternative hypothesis. And little by little, the puzzle comes together. That's hard. It's hard to keep up with all that. It's hard to know enough to pull that together for yourself. One of the things we do in studies to make up for the fact that every study is imperfect is we try to use lots of studies of lots of variables, lots of different ways of looking at these things that have lots of subjects, that has lots of kids in them. A study of 1,000 kids is more powerful than a study of 20 kids. It's not 50 times more powerful, but it's more powerful. And we look at lots of studies. So we want things repeated over and over again. We want things that fit together and help complete pictures of the puzzle. So, you shouldn't form an opinion. You shouldn't form a judgment about how reading or anything else with human beings works based on one study. And you shouldn't be shaken from what you're doing now based on one study. But as multiple studies come on board, as multiple studies start to influence the way you're thinking, you have to be willing to change what you believe. The other thing that comes up in all this is that you, me, everybody on this meeting right now have to rely to some extent on trusted experts who do have the time to review this research. That's what we do when we rely on something like the report of the National Reading Panel. We're relying on the team of experts that put that together. Because I don't know about you, I don't have the time to track all that down on my own. And even if you are relying on experts, a lot of times they're experts in one small area, and you might have to rely on multiple experts. So there have to be people you trust, but you should be open and listening to other points of view as well. David Kilpatrick told me there's probably about, he estimated there's probably about 600 new studies a year that are of high enough quality that they're worth reading and worth considering as he updates himself on the science of reading. And like he said, he can't read and understand 600 studies a year. And he's a scholar at a university who does have the time to do some of this. So you have to rely on multiple scholars and multiple sources of interpretation. So as Mick said, you can't always get what you want, but you can get what you need. It isn't going to be one study. It might be a whole collection of studies, and that's what you need. Everybody wants the one study, the one perfect study that answers all our questions. And it's just not possible to do. That's why we love meta-analyses. That's why we love these studies like the National Reading Panel that pull hundreds and hundreds of studies together. Before that, the report of the National Academy of Sciences that pulled hundreds and hundreds of studies together. And they rely very heavily on effect sizes. Now, I'm going to say something that's a little controversial. Depending on where you've been on Facebook the last couple of weeks, I got in a pretty heated argument with Matt Burns about what effect sizes really mean. So let me say this very, very carefully. Effect sizes are not a pure measurement of how effective the intervention in the study was. Even if you collect a number of studies, they're not necessarily good evidence of how effective the study was, which is hard to keep in mind because we call them effect sizes. But effect sizes are calculated. What they do is they take the difference between, so you have two groups of students, they start out about the same, you have a treatment group and a control group, and they start out about the same. The treatment group gets extra training in phonemic awareness, and the other group doesn't. The other group gets an extra recess, or the other group gets what's sometimes called BAU, business as usual. We don't do anything special for them, but this group over here gets extra training in phonemic awareness. Then we come back 6 months later and we measure something and we see how different they are. Effect size is that difference, that new difference between groups that used to be the same. We've created a difference. So that the size of that difference divided by the standard deviation of the groups. Either one group or the other group is sometimes the average standard deviation of the two groups. They do it different ways. Standard deviation of the groups is a measurement of how spread out the group is. So they all started with some degree of phonemic awareness, but they were spread out. Some kids had a little, some kids had a lot, some kids were in the middle someplace. There's a difference, there's some variability there. And standard deviation is a measure of how spread out the kids were on the variable to start with. So we take how much they changed and we divide it by how spread out they were. That's a really good thing to do. What it lets us do is it lets us take this study over here that's done one way, this study over here that's done a different way, this study that used this outcome measure, this study that used a little different outcome measure. It lets us take a whole bunch of studies of phonemic awareness instruction, reduce them all to this one number, an effect size, take the average effect size of all of them, and say something about how powerful or how effective, in a way, phonemic awareness is. But it's not that simple, because when we calculate effect size, we'd like to think it's a pure measure of how much change occurred in the groups. But because we divide it, and we have to for statistical reasons that I will not use to explode your mind, we have to divide it by that standard deviation. So what happens is if I had very little standard deviation in my group, if all my kids in my study were almost exactly the same on phonemic awareness to start with, then I'll be dividing that change by a very small number and I'll get a giant effect size. And some of that happens in studies. Some studies are kind of crafty. They design them specifically to produce a large effect size at the end. So you could have one study that got a lot of change in how well kids could read, and another study that got half as much change in how kids could read. But because this study that got the smaller change also had a smaller standard deviation, they're going to get a bigger effect size. And you might be left with the impression, wow, that way of teaching worked way better than this other way, when in fact it didn't. The other one actually did more. So we have to be careful about that. We have to look more deeply. Effect sizes allow us to combine lots of diverse studies, very different studies, to complete the puzzle. One study used one measure of reading at the end, another study used a different measure of reading at the end. But you do have to go into more detail to understand what's going on. Let me ask you this. This study, this graphic is going around now that suggests that teaching phonics or phonemic awareness has an effect size of about, they each have an effect size of about 0.4, but teaching fluency has an effect size of 0.7. And people are using that to say, wow, I should just be doing more fluency instruction than phonics and phonemic awareness instruction. Maybe there's some evidence for that, but you also have to consider the possibility, what if the fluency instruction was just being done with kids who had identified fluency difficulties, and they selected a group of kids who were pretty narrow, pretty much the same as each other, we call homogeneous. They're kind of very much the same as each other. That makes it easy to get a large effect size. And the other thing you should be asking yourself is, were they doing fluency instruction with kids who already had phonics and phonemic awareness? They were already good at that. They were good decoders. They just didn't have a lot of prosody when they read. They didn't have a lot of natural fluency when they read. And so for them, teaching fluency might be a really good idea. Just the fact that you get a bigger number there means you should pay attention to it. You should think about it. You should be aware of it. It's something you should know about. But you can't say if fluency instruction has an effect size of 0.7, and phonics and phonemic awareness each by themselves has an effect size of 0.4. That doesn't mean you should ditch phonics and phonemic awareness and run over and do a bunch more fluency. You shouldn't scratch out all those phonics and phonemic awareness sessions instruction in your planner for the year and replace them all with fluency. It doesn't work that way, but there are people who may want you to think it works that way. And we have to be very, very cautious about that. Let me ask a different question. You won't be able to answer because you're all muted, but phonics and phonemic awareness, if we're looking at just the effect of phonics and we're looking at just the effect of phonemic awareness, that doesn't tell us about the effect of doing both. What's the combined effect of doing both? You can't just add them together. You can't say 0.4 plus 0.4 gets you 0.8. Ooh, we're going to get a 0.8 effect size. It won't work that way. But in real life, you're not doing just one of them. In real life, you're doing 2 of them or 3 of them or 4 of them, and you have to keep that in mind as well. One of the things that I want to stress to people is studies sometimes isolate things because we want to study that very small variable. They isolate on purpose. They'll isolate phonics from phonemic awareness, but so we can study them separately. But that doesn't mean you should isolate them from each other. Doesn't mean you should say, no, this is my phonics block of time now, and we're just going to do phonics, and then later we'll do phonemic awareness. There may be very good value to blending those together and doing them together simultaneously, interacting with each other. The fact that the studies keep them separate doesn't mean you need to keep them separate. The fact that the studies keep phonics and fluency separate doesn't mean you need to keep them separate. There are ways of blending these things together, and there may be very good reasons to do that. So this, according to the American Psychological Association, if you talk about APA style, and there's a lot of APA style in the world, there's APA style that gives you guidance on whether or not to use the Oxford comma. I don't remember what the advice is on that, but most of the research papers you see will be in according to the APA style. And there's an actual small pamphlet or a book that tells you what to do. The 7 sections of a research paper in APA style are a title page, which is rarely a page, an abstract, which is just a fancy word for summary. It's nice to read abstracts. You can get all the abstracts for free. You might have to go through a paywall to get the paper. You can get all the abstracts for free. And it's tempting to read the abstract and just say, oh, now I know what the study was about. But that would be a mistake. There's an introduction, and I'm being very cynical here. This is what they want you to know before you go further. They want to get in there and adjust your thinking and get you thinking like them before you read the rest of the paper. And the introduction is very important. The introduction is very important, but I never read that first. I probably read the abstract first, but the thing I really try to get to right away is the method section. This tells you what they did. It tells you what they did, where their subjects came from. It tells you how they designed their study. It tells you what methods they used to change the way a kid reads or to teach something. It tells you how they measured the outcomes later. It tells you a lot of things about what they did. And if the method section is okay, if it seems like they did a good job, if it seems right, then I might bother to read the rest of the study. But there's a big difference in what different experiments and different studies try to do. You know, are they really measuring things well? Are they using known products? Think about the difference. You look at the methods, and the outcome for reading was how they did on a running record versus the outcome for reading was how well they did on an objective measure of comprehension versus maybe just an objective measure of word reading. Those would be very different studies. And I might want to invest more time and energy in one of them than in the other. The results, this is where people will try to lie to you. There are often very good gems, really good nuggets of information in the results section. And we'll go through a paper later that has some very interesting results in that section. But they can present them in huge tables of data, and you can get lost in terms of what you're finding there. It can be hard to see the stuff that really matters. There was a big kerfuffle last year in the world of reading about whether or not the National Reading Panel said that when you teach phonemic awareness, you should teach it with letters, which kind of makes it a little bit of a phonics exercise at the same time. The report of the National Reading Panel appears to say that teaching phonemic awareness with letters is more effective, is more beneficial than teaching it isolated from letters with just tokens or, you know, other non-letter cues on the board. It does seem to say that at one point. But if you get into the details of what those studies actually showed, the other thing you'll find, and I had to do some digging to find this, the other thing you'll find is that the studies that did phonemic awareness with letters also taught the kids for about 50 or 60% more minutes and hours than the other studies did. So were they better? Did they get better results because they included letters with phonemic awareness, or did they get better results because they just did more training in the first place? And then the other thing that was interesting was more than half of the studies that were classified as teaching phonemic awareness with letters started out in the study teaching it without letters, and then when kids reached a certain criteria, they introduced letters. So were they really teaching phonemic awareness with letters, or were they teaching phonemic awareness without letters and then went to a new step where they combined it with phonics and worked on kids, helping them bridge those two skills? those results can sometimes get lost. You can lose track of that in these big tables. But I always look at the methods very early. I want to see what they're doing. Then the discussion is what they want you to know before you leave. They're trying to tell you what you should think about their results. And that's very helpful to see. But you should also be skeptical and think what you think about their results. And we're going to look at a study in a little while in which that's very much the case. Then the references, the sources they cite to justify their idea. If you were a scholar, you might read these references and know on your own, yeah, that's right, that's what that study said. But you might also recognize some places where they cite papers that, wait a minute, that's not what that study said. That's not what they did. Richard Allington, a number of years ago, along with 2 or 3 other people, was paid a lot of money to write a special paper for the Milwaukee public school system near where Mary and I live, guiding them about their literacy plan. And he cited 84, they've cited 84 or 85 papers in their reference section that they used as the basis for the recommendations. At least 2 of them, and I know there was more, but at least 2 of them that they cited actually said the exact opposite of what Allington cited the papers for. A paper by Frank Vellatino and a paper by Joe Torgeson. I reached out to both of them, and they actually wrote letters to the Milwaukee public school system. They wrote letters to the school board and the superintendent and said, that's not what my study says, and you should be very cautious about going forward and believing what Allington and these other guys have written in this paper. That's very hard for you to do. That's very hard for me to do, to track those things down. But those things do go on, even in a world of peer review. Those things go on. Peer review is supposed to catch those things, but this was a private paper written for a school district that had no peer review. And so those things can happen. We have to be very cautious and be very skeptical and realize that people are trying to deceive us. So why methods? It defines the limits of what you can infer from statistics. What's there and what isn't there in the methods. Let me ask you, if you saw a study that showed that program X, kids who got program X did better than the control group on a later test of reading comprehension, you'd say program X was very effective. Program X worked. Would it matter to you if the kids in the control group got nothing, if they got no instruction? They got nothing. We did nothing for them, but the other group got program X. That's a very different study than if that group got program X and the other group got program Y, and X was better than Y. Now we can say X is better than Y. Before we could only say X is better than nothing. It's better than doing nothing. People try to use effect sizes to make up for that, to say, well, program X got a bigger effect size in that study than program Y got in a different study. But those were different groups of kids from different school systems where the outcomes were measured in different ways. You can't use that to say for sure that X is better than Y. If X had an effect size of 0.9 and Y had an effect size of 0.2, you can probably be pretty sure X was better than Y. But if X has a effect size of 0.6 and Y has an effect size of 0.5, that's too close. That could be caused by a lot of things in the design. It's not a substitute for having one study where we compare X and Y. We look at X in this study, we look at Y in this study. They're a little different from each other, but you can't use effect sizes to substitute for studies that haven't been done, to substitute for better design. And I'm frustrated. I'm sometimes a lone voice on this. I'm frustrated because that goes on all the time. And if we're honest, it goes on for the programs that we don't like, and it goes on for programs that we do like too. Lots of people like to look at, John Hattie does some of this stuff, where you look big effect size for this, big effect size for this, big effect, smaller effect size. What gets you the bigger effect size? If you're comparing the biggest effect size to the smallest effect size, you're probably pretty safe. But if you're comparing effect sizes that are somewhat similar to each other and concluding, oh, this is more worth my time than other things, it doesn't really work that way. And we have to be very conscious about it because the devil is always in the details. And also, If you're looking at the effect size of one study, that's one thing. If you're looking at the effect size of lots of studies combined together, that's something else. And more studies are better, more subjects are better, more different ways of doing this, the study is better. I'm really trying to get you to be skeptical and to not think that a number or statistic is the end of the conversation. And I hope you're going to see that in a little while when we get to some of the other stuff I'm going to show you. Some things to watch for when you're looking at a study. What was the control group and what did they get? I talked about that a little bit earlier. Well, who was in the control group and what did they get? Some simple studies, some very simple studies, and these are very poorly designed, but people can be sucked in on them, are the control group is the pretest. So I take 100 kids, I measure where they are at in reading, I put them all into program Y or program X. 6 months later, they're doing this much better. And I'm comparing how they are now to how they used to be. That's not a very good study because I don't know if it's program X that made them better, or is it just time passing? Are they getting bigger and having other experiences? Is that really what's doing it? That's why we need that control group that doesn't get program X. Ideally, we need a control group that gets nothing, a control group that gets program X, a control group that gets program Y, a control group that gets program Z, so we can compare them all to each other. The problem with that is where am I going to get all these kids? I don't know if you've ever tried to do human subjects research. I did when I was still in graduate school. I had to do some of that. Just coming up with subjects is almost impossible. My whole life, my whole career, my dissertation depended on coming up with subjects for study, and I wasn't coming up with any subjects for study. Then a principal at a local high school befriended me and gave me access to his kids in this high school. He let them skip classes to come be part of my study. And he saved my life, or I might still have not gotten my PhD. Coming up with subjects is really, really difficult. The other thing you want to look at is the treatment kid group all kids? Is it all third graders in the school? Is it a cross section of third graders? Or is it just disabled kids? Is it kids who are just behind in reading? Is it kids who are just good readers? What are we really finding out here? What are we really looking at? You know, you're going to get a bigger effect size if you start with kids who are sometimes if you start with kids who are struggling, so they have a long way to go. What's the benefit of teaching phonics to kids who already know phonics? You know, if you come into a 5th grade classroom and you teach a bunch of phonics to all of them, and measure what an effect it had on their reading, you might see no effect at all, because most of these kids are already good at this. But if you sort out just the kids who are struggling, you might find a different effect size. On the other hand, if your subject group is kids who are disabled readers, legitimately neurologically dyslexic kids, you might get very small effect sizes because, as you all know better than I do, they're a really tough group of kids to teach to read. And so we won't be as surprised when we get small effect sizes. On the other hand, if you teach phonics and phonemic awareness to 5th graders, you know, the second half of 5-year-old kindergarten, the first half of 1st grade, you might get massive effect sizes because they're soaking this stuff up. This is like, you know, pouring water on fresh young plants. They're growing like crazy. There's a lot you can measure. There's a lot going on. Whereas the same intervention 3, 4, 5 years later with just the kids who are still struggling, you might get very small effect sizes because these are tough kids to teach. This is a very difficult population to work with. And then you have to ask yourself, do the findings fit the rest of the science, or is this implausible? Does the finding fit the rest of the science, or is this, yeah, I know they got results, they're telling me they got results, but is this really plausible? Does reading work this way? Does this fit with the rest of what I know about the science? That's one of the challenges we run into when we try to change the way people teach reading and how states mandate reading be taught and how they regulate the literacy instruction. Is we're working from our body of knowledge and science, and we're looking at things and saying that makes sense to me and that doesn't make sense to me, and that fits the science but that doesn't fit the science. But people who have a very different understanding of what the science is, other people have a very different understanding of the science, are looking at our studies of teaching phonics and phonemic awareness, of using decodable books and explicit instruction. And they're saying, that doesn't seem right to me. There's something wrong with that study, because that's not how I understand reading works. So we have to be very cautious about that. And you have to be cautious when researchers oversell their results. Everybody oversells their results. When it's somebody teaching something we like, promoting something we like, we look the other way. Oh, this is great. This is wonderful. Look at how wonderful these results are. We tend to not be as critical of the flaws in their study and their excessive enthusiasm as we are when we look at whole language or balanced literacy. And we have to own that. We have to be honest about that. Everybody's trying to sell us something. Everybody's trying to twist our judgment a little bit so they can squeeze money out of us or our school district. So let's talk for a minute. What does this look like in real life? We're going to walk through the results of what LLI refers to as the gold standard study. And I've got a link here that you can go to look at the study yourself. Let me tell you one of the things I noticed when I look at the study, and I'm not going to put the whole study up here. Their discussion, their introduction section is huge. It's enormous. They go on for page after page, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 pages, trying to shape your thinking before you ever get to the results of the study. They're trying to prime you up. They're trying to influence you. They're trying to get you to believe in what they're going to tell you before you actually see what they do. But they call this the gold standard study. And the reason they call it a gold standard study is because it used a randomized control group. There were kids, they separated them out. They made sure the two groups were very even to start with. They've got a lot of kids. There's lots of schools in this study. There's over 300 kids. It might be a lot over 300 kids. I don't remember, but there's a lot of kids in the study. And LLI says it's the gold standard study. And if you read the abstract, they say that LLI had massive effects, huge effects on reading in kindergarten, first and second grade. Kids who got LLI did way better than kids who didn't. And they did, except they didn't. And let's look at what that looks like and how they tricked people with their gold standard study. This is the summary they gave in this results section. This is the summary you read right before you see the table of results. And I'll show you the table of results soon. Overall, fewer significant gains were seen with the Dibbles outcomes. However, kindergartners in LLI significantly exceeded those who were not in LLI on nonsense word fluency. Also for phoneme segmentation. ELL students in the treatment group outperformed ELL subjects in the control group, as well as non-ELL subjects. Their massive results came not on Dibbles. Their massive results came on the running records they did with these kids. They had huge differences in running records and much more modest differences, and in many cases, no differences at all on Dibbles outcome. They didn't want to talk about the Dibbles outcome. They really wanted to talk about, if you read the abstract, they talk almost exclusively about the results from the running records from their their own assessment system. So let's look at the table of results for kindergartners. What I want you to look for when you look at tables like this, they were telling you to expect a lot. What I want you to look for is asterisks. Asterisks are used to mark results that are significant, statistically significant. In this case, one asterisk means it was significant at 0.05. If there were two asterisks, that would mean that we're even more confident something happened. 3 asterisks, really, really confident that something happened. I'll clue you in on something. In my dissertation, I had p-values that were 0.00001. I got some huge effect sizes in some of the things I did. I got some huge results in some of the things I did. Now, looking at the table of numbers up here, we have, going down under F, we have 6 results. We have 6 inferential statistics, starting with 5.97, running down to the bottom at 0.68. How many have an asterisk next to them? Only 2. The other 4 are not statistically significant. What this shows us is that in kindergarten, when we grouped everybody together, there was a modest benefit to doing LLI, but most of that comes from the ELL kids. Most of that comes from the kids who are English language learners. If we look at kids in special ed, there were only 4 of them, but we got no results. 24 African-American kids, we got no significant results. 21 white kids, we got no significant results. 24 Hispanic kids, we got no significant results. It's really the ELL kids who are carrying the day here. And for everybody else, not much happened. Not much happened. You can ignore, don't worry about the rest of the numbers. Don't be too caught up in the rest of the numbers. Don't be hypnotized by this table of Greek letters and confusing numbers. Not much happened. And the next question you might want to ask is, what did the kids in the control group get? They got nothing. The kids in the control group got nothing. So we spent 30 weeks or whatever it is doing LLI, so many minutes a day, putting all this time into it. And for the most part, those kids didn't do any better than if they had gotten nothing. But they did a lot better on the running record. Why might that be? Put on your skeptic hat, put on your be a doubting Thomas, be hard on people. Why might that be? One of the questions you might want to ask yourself is, who gave them the running records? The running records were given by their teachers, who were all LLI teachers and pulling for LLI to do well. And they were giving the running records to the kids in both the experimental and the control group. And what happens if you're in LLI for 30 weeks? They assess you all the time. You get a lot of running records. You're used to doing a running record. You're good at doing a running record because they've been giving them to you all the time. You're getting lots of practice at the process of a running record as a student. And then I'm going to compare you to some kid in the control group who hasn't been assessed with running records, who now gets a running record for maybe the second time in their life, from a teacher who knows. Here's another thing you should know about this study. The teachers who did the running records knew who was in the control group. They knew not all the students in the school were in this control group. They knew who was in there. And they may have been motivated to score them a little lower, to be a little harder on them, to use their subjective judgment about the study. You should expect studies should be designed to reduce those sources of bias. It's called blindness. And we'll talk ideally, the running records would have been given by an outside teacher who had no idea whether the student she was assessing was in the study or in the control group. But that's not what they did. And that introduces an opportunity at bias. But if you had read this, you would think, wow, there's a lot that happened here. There really isn't that much that happened here. There really isn't that much that happened here. This is not what we would call robust results. This is not what we would call robust results. So this is the kindergarten dibbles. Here's some more kindergarten results. See a lot of asterisks on this page? See a lot of what's going on here? This is nonsense word fluency, but there's other things here. They didn't tell you about that before. They also did initial sound fluency. Look at that. See any asterisks? I don't. They also did letter naming fluency. See any asterisks? I don't. They also did phoneme segmentation fluency. See any asterisks? There's one. There's one. They put this table in there real big and bold, wanted you to see it because they had 2 significant results. But these other things matter too. Initial sound fluency, that's no better. Letter naming fluency is no better. Phoneme segmentation fluency is no better, except for ELL kids. They're not getting any results. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to point that out to you, but they're not getting any results. First grade dibbles. Overall, similar significant differences between treatment and control groups are seen with the first grade significantly exceeded those who were not in LLI on nonsense word fluency. Let's look at the actual numbers. They're trying to make this sound as good as they can. So in the aggregate, the kids did better, but in this case, it was only Hispanic Latino kids who did significantly better on their own, 28 of them. SPED kids, there were only 3, ELL, there were only 10. White non-Hispanic didn't do well. Nobody did much better except really than the Hispanic and Latino kids. Guess what? Let's go on to these tables. We have a few more significant results for oral reading fluency and Dibble's letter naming, but not many. We don't have big, powerful results. This is disappointing. Most of these kids didn't do any better than if they had gotten nothing. By second grade, now they have to admit it, overall, no significant differences were found between treatment and control groups for second grade on either subtest that was administered as intended for second graders, nonsense word fluency and oral reading fluency. While unexpected, this result may simply indicate that second grade Dibble's measurements were not sufficiently aligned with the second grade LLI curriculum or benchmarks to detect small effects. Think about what they're telling you here. They're saying, we didn't get any results, but we don't think it's our fault. We think Dibble's is no good. We think Dibble's doesn't line up enough with what we teach in LLI to get results. We'd rather talk about our running record because that lines up real closely with what we're teaching. But they didn't develop those skills. They also described this nonsense of a washout effect from averaging across different schools' scores. They want you to believe that maybe it worked at one school, but not at another. The bottom line is this is not good results. There's our tables with no asterisks. But if you read the summary that they created for these results, you would think their results were glowing. This is a study that LLI markets as their gold standard. The publication, the in-house publication of the study is over 90, it might be over 100 pages long, and most principals and curriculum directors and teachers aren't going to read it. They're going to read the little blurb that comes in the advertising material saying, we got great results. They only got great results on a subjective measure that's an integral part of LLI, that LLI essentially is teaching you how to take this test. That's the only place they got significant results. It's the only place. It's the only place that the results came up big and flashy. The bottom line on this is we need to be very skeptical when we see these results, and we need to be very skeptical about everybody's research. We need to be very skeptical about our own studies and the things we like. Too often, we overlook the inadequacy of studies. We get too excited about results. I have to admit, I was as guilty as anybody when that study was released in pre-publication that said by Henry May and his team that said that being in reading recovery was actually harmful to you by the time you got to 3rd or 4th grade. You would have been better off getting nothing. I wanted to pop champagne corks and throw a party. But that's not really fair. I should be as skeptical about that study as I am about these studies. And I'm just like you. When I see a result I like, I don't look at the study. I'll just trust what they tell me. You know, we all do that. And as we go forward, we have to not do that. We have to not be like that. We're winning the day. We're winning on the field. We're winning in government. We're winning in the rooms where these decisions are being made. We're going to be the people guiding curriculum. And we can't make the mistake as we do that, as we get more power and more influence, we can't make the same mistake that the people we're displacing have made. We cannot be philosophers and ideologues. We have to be painfully honest about these things and represent ourselves and our research much more honestly than the people who came before us represented theirs. We have to be as hard on the studies we like as we are on the studies we don't like, or we're just going to be the next group that can't be trusted. We're just going to be the next group that traded science for a philosophy. You know, we see some of that. You know, one of the things that we see on our side of the fence is if you look at the studies of the effectiveness of OG compared to other scientifically based methods of teaching reading, it's not particularly dramatically better. In some cases, it might be worse. Some of that is because these OG studies are being done on disabled kids and they're notoriously hard to teach. So there's a lot that's going on in there, but you will still find people out there who insist no study is a good study unless it's rooted, no method of teaching is good unless it's rooted in Orton Gillingham. If it's not Orton Gillingham, they don't want to see it. That's not really a justifiable position. The research really wouldn't justify that position. You see people who, less than we did at one time, were absolutely determined that all this instruction has to include really extensive multisensory element to it. That there might be some research to support that with disabled readers, but there's nothing that supports that with typically developing readers. You almost certainly don't need to do that. Now there may be people on this call, on this presentation right now would say, no, must do multisensory, absolutely must. If you're not, you're letting these kids down. We must do it. Maybe not. Is that the best way to spend time? We have to be open to the fact that not everything we believe is as rooted in science as we think it is. We have to be open to the idea that we're going to learn some things too. We have to be willing to change. And Mary and I were talking about this, and Jeannie was part of the conversation before we began. There's a real challenge in not being too welded to what you do and the way you do it, that you're unwilling to change, and the balance between that and being so willing to change that you're bouncing around like a dry leaf being blown across your yard in the fall. You can't let the next study change everything that you do, but you also can't fail to let studies, as they accumulate, change what you do. You can't change too easily, but you also can't change too hard. And finding that balance can be very difficult. And I think you have to look to your peers. You have to look to trusted scientists. You have to look at what you know about the science, the deep science of reading, to be able to do that effectively. But it's a huge challenge. It's not a simple thing to do. And we have to rely on other people. We have to rely on good conferences, good researchers, good scholars to help us be able to do that. Does anybody have any questions?
There was one, not a question, but a comment that the link that you put in your PowerPoint presentation to the LLI study does not work anymore.
Oh, no, it worked a couple hours ago.
Is there another place that we could look for that?
So the way I always find it is I Google LLI gold standard study, and you'll find it in the research at their website about LLI. You can go down. It was done in Memphis, and you can find this study. It was by the CREP people at Memphis, at the University of Memphis. It was done in 2010, and you can find it that way. This is a study I've had people contact me and say, my district is buying LLI, and this is the study they're using to justify it. Help me. And try to guide them. And I think there's some districts I've stopped that way, but there's a lot of districts that say, I don't care. And the reason they don't care is LLI, they like what it says. It fits their philosophy of reading. It fits what they already believe. So they're willing to take it in without being very skeptical. If we're honest, we do the same thing. We accept things without very much skepticism because it fits what we all already believe. We have to be cautious about falling into those traps where we're holding different research to different standards. If I like what you're telling me, I just accept what you say. And if I don't like what you're telling me, I pick you apart at every level. I do that. Everybody does that.
We have reached 7:30. There are a couple little questions that maybe you can give us your impression on. Jeannie asks, how do we respond when someone asks, what does the research say? And Marcy is asking, what do you think about the term settled science? Do you want to respond to those?
So let me take the last one first. There is such a thing as settled science. There are things in science that are so well supported by the evidence and so well reinforced by other bits of evidence. They're so well grounded that they're settled science. Gravity is settled science. The shape of the earth is settled science. The rings of Saturn are settled science. That the earth orbits the sun and not the other way around is settled science. And there's some settled science in reading, I think. It's pretty much settled in teaching kids to read the English language, that phonics and phonemic awareness and all the things related to helping them decode words from the relationship of letters to sounds, the relationships of graphemes to phonemes. It's pretty much settled science that is better and does a better job of leading to what we call orthographic mapping than other ways of learning, of trying to solve those unknown words. I think that's pretty much settled science. We're not going to find something out in the next 50 years that makes the pendulum swing back the other way. I hate it when people talk about the pendulum swings and then one thing's in and then another thing's in, like the hemlines on women's skirts. These are not fads. These are not fashion statements. But if you go much beyond that and you say, and people start to say, well, there's settled science that you have to teach this before this, and it's settled science that I have to do this in my classroom. It's settled science that I do this. Probably not. It's probably settled science that integrating reading with writing is very, very good, and you'll get better results if you do work those in a reciprocal relationship. There's increasingly settled science, I think, that if you're teaching phonics isolated by itself and phonemic awareness isolated by itself and fluency isolated by itself, that if you can kind of smear those together and integrate them with each other, work spelling in there, work some writing in there, kind of work all those things in one kind of stew of teaching, which is really hard to do, I think. If you can do more of that, that's probably settled science that's better. But if people say there's settled science that you should teach this sound before this sound, and that you have to teach this or that you should never teach that, that's probably not true. That's probably a grain of certainty that we can't get to that kind of fine grained certainty, particularly because these kids are so different. You know, I think teachers and people and tutors and people who teach reading are always going to need to rely on their instinct. This is a kid, maybe I need to do it a little different way. This is a kid who maybe needs a little more of this than of this. That's going to always be the art of what people do. And what was the other question?
Well, by now we have, of course, a couple other questions. Jeannie has a very general question about how do you respond when somebody asks you what does the research say? Now we have a couple of more specific questions. I hear a lot of concern about iReady in particular. What are we looking for to tell teachers and parents about the worthiness or validity of this assessment and other commercial ones that are flourishing now? And then Bonnie, I just want to respond to you before Steve gets going, and then we're going to wrap this up. Bonnie wants to know if there's a recording of this session that you can share with others. And yes, we are recording, and we will upload the recording to the YouTube channel of the Reading League Wisconsin, not the Reading League, but the Reading League Wisconsin. And it will be, there's no password, so anybody can access it on there. Okay, go ahead, Steve.
So what I tell people when they say, you know, what's the science of reading? What does it say about this? And that's Jeannie's question. I always try to start by saying the body of science, the whole integrated body of sciences is everything from eye movement studies to measurements of evoked potentials with wires on people's head to fMRI studies of what parts of the brain are using
Yeah, you froze.
The most oxygen and burning the most calories while you read, plus classroom-based studies, plus Mark Seidenberg's machine learning computer modeling of reading. What all of them say together is you should be teaching kids to decode words by drawing their attention to letters and sounds. That's how kids should learn to decode words. That leads to orthographic mapping. Other ways of teaching them to solve and decode words are far less likely to lead to orthographic mapping. And that fits what we know about how brains work. That fits how we know the language works. That fits what we see in classroom studies. If you want a more definitive statement about Does it say I should buy this curriculum or that curriculum? Except to say, how well does it match what I just described about how kids learn to read? That's about as much as you can say is the settled science. The less settled science leads you into more vague areas. The other thing we should understand about science is a better job of telling us what's wrong than telling us what's right. And what science has told us clearly is the theories of Marie Clay, which are inherited by Fountas and Pinnell, which were picked up in a sloppy way by Lucy Calkins, which we find in the work of recreated in the work of Ken Goodman and Frank Smith, in the way that influenced multiple generations of teachers in teaching. Those are wrong. That's also settled science. Those are wrong. Kids do not figure out words, not that they can't, but skilled readers do not figure out words by looking at one or two letters and using background knowledge. They do not look at one letter, the general shape of the word, the general length and shape of the word, and where it's high and where it's low, and how many letters hang below the line and how many letters extend above it, all this crap that Marie Clay said. They do not do that, plus the first letter, to figure out the word. They just don't. So any kind of teaching that's based on that theory is probably a bad idea. I don't need, if your theory of the motion of the planets is that the sun goes around the earth, I don't need to know the rest of what you say about how astronomy works, because you got that one so wrong. I don't care about the rest of your predictions. I don't care that what you tell me about the rest of it. That's just wrong. And so
I think we've gone pretty far over time now, and I just want to get to that one question about iReady, and then we'll wrap it up for tonight. I don't really know that much about iReady, but there's a
I don't know that much about iReady either. The thing you always want to look at with, and this can be difficult, the thing you always want to look at with assessments is there's measures of predictive validity. Do they do a good job of predicting which kids will struggle and which kids won't? The higher the score for validity, the better. You can look at something called classification accuracy, which isn't validity over the whole scale, but how good does it do at telling us which kids belong in remediation and which kids are doing well? Does it classify those kids well? Does it divide them? If you can divide your class into the kids who get extra help and the kids who don't need extra help, does it do a good job of doing that? And you have to be careful, because all these studies, even the ones we like, they're trying to look as good as they can. So they're going to massage their statistics and do what they can. The best early screener I've ever seen statistically is something called PAR, the predictive assessment of reading. But there are people on our side of the fence who really hate the predictive assessment of reading because it doesn't include nonsense word reading. And there are people who are absolutely convinced if you don't have kids reading nonsense words, you're missing a big part of what's going on, and you're not going to catch kids who struggle. There's a place for nonsense word reading, but statistically, the people who developed PAR, they did it with and without nonsense word reading. And they said, we didn't really get better results at that stage of assessment, including it. So we left it out because we didn't want to waste time on it. There are some people on our side of the fence that are really shocked by that, because in their mind, it should always include nonsense word reading. What I say about screening is some things about screening can be unexpected. If somebody showed me with a screening measure that I could count the number of hairs on a person's head and divide them, and that was a really good way of dividing kids into different treatment groups, even though there's no face validity in that, there's no reason that counting hairs on their head should lead to a good result. But if it works, I might do it. And then I'd have to do diagnostic testing on the kids who got sent to the treatment group to figure out what they need. That's the real reason you want face validity, and you want your screener to be as thorough and complete as possible, so it gives you a head start on knowing what these kids need. If all you know is this kid is struggling more than this kid, but you don't have a hint as to why, you have a lot of testing left to do. And some screeners give you more diagnostic information, give you a better head start on diagnostic information than others. And so they may be worth more time.
The one place you might want to look is whether you're looking at an intervention or an assessment, is the National Center on Intensive Intervention. It's from American Institutes for Research. It's if you just, I think it's, the website is intensiveintervention.org, and they have tool charts on there. They have overviews, so you can look at ratings of different, the ratings of different assessment tools and the validity and the reliability, and they rate all these different things. So at least you could compare with other tools, and that might give you some, some hard information to discuss if you're talking about a tool, whether it's iReady or a different tool. I very often hear this website recommended by national experts in assessment and in intervention, and the charts are pretty good.
Yeah.
I think we're going to kind of stop it here because we're well over time now. And I just want to thank everybody for attending tonight, and just remind you that, yes, the recording will be on our YouTube channel. And I did post the link in the chat. If you need a certificate of attendance, please fill out that little short form and submit it tonight. And stay in touch with us. When you signed up for this, you were on our website, and all of our events are on our website. We have one more Teachers Lounge this month with Jeannie on a Saturday morning, where you bring your questions and discuss what you want to discuss. And then early April, we have a session on a Tuesday evening with Jan Hasbrook discussing fluency. So I think that'll be an excellent session also. So we just invite you to stay in touch with us, and we hope to see you back for our next production. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
All right.